you so much, David. Good evening. It's great to be here. That was a sure energy booster. So if I start to flag, I hope that blue guy can come up here. I am the mother of a 5-month-old baby girl who I absolutely adore. But David and I were chatting before, and he told me one of you out there is a trained professional in baby sleep therapy. So please come find me after this. It would be so helpful. But sleep deprivation aside, I'm so delighted to be here with you today to talk about a subject that I hope is a shared passion and has been my passion for the last 15 years, which is really this question of how do we create organizations that are healthy in the broadest sense of the term. And I think that word healthy goes right to the core of what I think is the most crucial question facing leaders of all stripes today, which is, how do we create organizations that are fundamentally fit for the future, that are genuinely fit for human beings? And unfortunately, most organizations today really just aren't. And the fact is, the modern organization, the organization that a lot of us work in and come into contact with in day in, day out, you saw that in that video, is a relic. It's, 100 years ago, it was invented to maximize standardization, specialization, predictability, to control, to really solve for different challenges than we face today, revving up those engines of mass production and the industrial economy, essentially strapped flesh and blood, free-thinking human beings into the straitjacket of institutional obedience and compliance and conformance. And we've really never left that factory mentality behind. And that's really what I'm interested in today, that how today, when the challenge is to become more resilient, more inventive, more inspiring, more accountable, how do we rethink how we manage organizations, define leadership, measure value, and design work in a real way going forward? And I would submit that we're at a real inflection point when it comes to how we organize and inspire human effort, and that the best and most vibrant organizations are really experimenting with what gets people out of bed in the morning. Now, the good news is this time we're going with the grain of human nature. If the old question is how do we turn human beings into widget-producing robots, the new question is how do we unleash human flourishing? How do we multiply the impact of human accomplishment? So to unpack that question, I would put 3 other questions on any leader's agenda, on your agenda as folks who really are thinking about what does it mean to have a healthy workplace, and those of you who lead workplaces, I would submit these are sort of the 3 questions you need to be productively wrestling with if you want to be truly healthy, truly resilient, inventive, inspiring, and all that good stuff. So the first question is, what ideas are worth fighting for? More and more, the value you create is a product of the values you exude and assert as an organization. And organizations that are sort of built around a higher sense of purpose exude passion. They're breeding grounds for the stuff that is really the ultimate multiplier of human effort. The second question is, what does it mean to build an organization that is as human as the human beings who work inside of it? And how do you create environments and systems for work that unleash that sort of potent mixture of initiative, imagination, and passion, those human qualities that cannot be commanded, they can only be invited and inspired? And the third question is, how do you create a genuine culture of innovation? How do you make innovation everybody's job every day? How do you support people in making a vital contribution, feeling like they're really part of determining the fate and the destiny of your organization? So let me dive right in to that first question, around that sense of purpose. Now, every vibrant, resilient, innovative organization that I've come into contact with over the past couple decades seems to exhibit a striking clarity about who they are. They really know what they stand for. And lots of people talk about purpose and mission and business, and you'd be hard-pressed to find an organization that doesn't have its mission statement plastered on the wall. But I would submit you'd be hard-pressed to find many that really mean it. Now, when you mean it, when you're working towards some original purpose that you're really trying to do something important and different in the world, purpose is this deeply felt and utterly distinctive sense of what you're about. It's a set of ideas that fundamentally reshapes the sense of what's possible for your people, for your customers, for the wider world. And I would suggest that we live in a world where it's not enough to build a high-functioning, high-performing organization. You really have to advocate. You really have to stand for a cause. You have to promote a vision of the future that really changes things for your industry, for your profession, and you have to pull people along toward that future. You have to make a case for why what you do matters. Now, I want to note here that purpose is not nice. It's not, a generic statement of goodness. It's really about sharpening your edges. And nobody understands this better than my friend Roy Spence, who's a co-founder of GSD&M, a free-spirited ad agency based in Austin, Texas. They grew up with Southwest Airlines, Walmart. They're behind that indelible anti-litter campaign, Don't Mess with Texas. And he is just a passionate and articulate advocate when it comes to competing on purpose. He also makes a really mean salsa. And a couple years ago, he started a business based on this passion of his. It's called Royitos Hot Sauce. Really great stuff. You can only get it in Austin. Their tagline, I think, is instructive. Don't do mild. We don't do mild. I just love that. We don't do mild because as goes with salsa, so goes with purpose inside organizations. When you have that kind of spicy, fiery, galvanizing sense of purpose, what it really does is it switches you from that age-old question, that chestnut that seems to end every CNBC interview of a CEO, what keeps you up at night, to a much more important question. What gets you out of bed in the morning? Do you have a sense of purpose so compelling that it's infinitely more inspiring and urgent than all of that sort of distraction and fear and shifting winds that cause most people to sort of freeze up or to flail? That's what I mean by that sense of purpose. And the organizations that have it, you can really see it. You walk into them, you feel it in the bones and the wind and what's going on inside the organization. Take Whole Foods Market, for instance. Their incredible rise to dominance, at $12 billion in revenue this year, 300 stores, is really a function of their original doctrine of shared fate. Now, of course, they reinvented what it means to be a grocery store as some kind of nirvana, and they keep changing that up year in and year out. But if you look at their key forks in the road, their important decisions year in and year out, whether it was to think about how they connect with their partners and suppliers, how they get their own team members on a path to health, where they're investing very heavily, how they think about labeling genetically modified products, you name it, it's always guided by this principle of the interdependence of stakeholders. And that's their unique doctrine that they follow, and it's what sets them apart and what helps them make decisions day in and day out. Or take Southwest Airlines. It's the classic but still inspiring example of competing on purpose. Everything about that organization, business model, its operations, it's the people they hire, their people practices day in and day out has to do with that notion of how do we democratize the skies? How do we give regular folks the freedom to fly, which has arguably changed the airline business. And you look at organizations like Southwest, like Whole Foods Markets, and others like them, and you see a remarkable performance in the marketplace over decades upon decades. But more importantly, what you see are organizations that have created a true passion brand in categories that were, before devoid of any kind of passion. It's really remarkable to see. And I think what's also instructive is nothing is harder as a leader than saying no to an attractive opportunity. And in these organizations where everybody knows what they stand for and what they're for and what they're against, what they will never do, it's incredibly easy. They're masterful when it comes to those invisible decisions that really shape the fate of an organization when you say no to things as opposed to sort of the splashy stuff that you go off and do. And I think it's just so powerful and so inspiring. And it suggests a couple questions to anyone thinking about this issue of purpose. And the first I sort of stated up front is, what ideas are you fighting for in your organization, in your association, even if you have a solo practice? What ideas are you fighting for? What do you stand for, and what are you against? Where do you draw that line in the sand? What's the compelling why behind your organization, your business, your profession? And what are you the most of? Not the biggest, not the best, but are you the friendliest? Are you the funniest? Are you the most family-oriented? What are you the most of? And articulating that is, I think, a really productive conversation inside any organization. One thing to think about here, a little corollary, is that increasingly the big ideas behind the best organizations contain higher ideals. The business world really has woken up to this idea that their responsibility extends beyond profits into the wider world and society and the planet. And there's so much experimentation and creativity around how can business be a positive force for change. And it's not just because there's this exploding market for all things green and good, that is part of it, but it's also because people increasingly are looking inside and saying, what's worth my life? Do I want to post-rationalize a career spent striving with retirement and some, service in my retirement? People increasingly want to be called up. They don't want to so much work for you or for a company as they want to work on something meaningful, something important, something that might change the world. And the second question that is very related to this first one about what ideas are you fighting for is, are you really who you say you are? It's one thing to craft this beautiful statement of purpose in soaring language, and it's another thing to sort of live it day in and day out, to match up behavior to belief. We, as psychologists, that's the hardest thing in the world for all of us to do. So how do you sort of brutally, transparently ask and answer that question? Are you really who you say you are? Take Patagonia. We all know the outdoor clothing maker who, was founded on the sort of dirtbag values of Yvon Chouinard, now a $400 million brand that's dedicated to the mission of inspiring and implementing solutions to the environmental crisis, not making clothes. That's their mission. But of course, being a clothing maker, they are an incredibly resource-intense business, and everything they do and all their processes kind of contribute to that problem they're trying to alleviate. So I talked to the CEO there, Casey Sheehan, and he just says to me point blank, look, we're dirty. We admit it. Everything we make pollutes. There's no such thing as a sustainable company. Well, there is such thing as a company that is so transparent, so sort of refreshingly out there and open with every impact that it is making in the world, that it becomes part of the conversation. They launched something called the Footprint Chronicles, which is sort of like a corporate social responsibility report on steroids a few years ago, and it's become kind of the state of the art when it comes to telling your story in a way that engages all of your constituents in an honest, open conversation. And that approach has translated into how they talk to each other inside the organization. They think of it as sort of a no-secrets environment. If we're not wrestling honestly with the hard questions inside the organization, then we're not going to be able to do that outside the organization. And that seamlessness between who Patagonia is at home and who they are in the marketplace is, I would suggest, incredibly healthy, and not a lot of organizations are like that. So let me move on to the second question, which is, really about how do we create organizations that are as human as the human beings who work inside of them. As I said before, so much of organizational life goes against the grain of our basic humanity. And you just talk to 5 people on the street, you get that sense right away. You hear words like toxic, what's the best kind of work? Not working at all. But I think it has to do with not with any kind of, human venality or leaders who are not up to the task. It really has to do with these structural issues I mentioned up top, which is that the ruling ideology of organizations, just sort of structured in, has been control, controlling people, controlling information, controlling deviations from the norm. And that's been going on for years and years and years, and it really does need to stop. It's the wrong design when it comes to unleashing and mobilizing those qualities I talked about: imagination, passion, and initiative. So, what is The right design? Well, there's no one right design when it comes to humanizing organizations and switching on all of the people inside an organization, but I would suggest there is one crucial ingredient, and that is shifting the balance from control to freedom. The fact is, the ruling values of so many organizations today don't sync up with the values that are animating so much of what is good in this world and in our culture: freedom, openness, collaboration, community, meritocracy. Now, the good news is we actually have a very potent example of those principles at work today. It's called the internet, and it's not just a great source of new business models and operating systems and technology tools, it's actually a source of a powerful new management model. You know, thanks to the web, we can imagine organizations that are large but not bureaucratic, that are efficient but not inflexible, that are disciplined but not disempowering. And while the web has a ton of limitations, it is a relentlessly productive seedbed when it comes to producing organizational forms that, you know, where ideas all compete on equal footing, where your contribution matters more than your credentials, where coordination happens without centralization, where, you know, sharing creates power much more than hoarding. It really is a great example for us, and it's more important not just because, you know, we need all to sort of be fluent with the web, but because increasingly it's reaching into every corner of organizations, and it's sort of the DNA of the next generation of leaders. The internet, the web, these principles around meritocracy, freedom, and openness, that's simply how they live their life. It's sort of the operating system of how they work, play, learn, and connect. And I would suggest that increasingly they're going to expect that the social context of their organizations matches up to the social context of the web. Now, a decidedly unwebby organization that's been wrestling really productively with these principles for many, many years is WL Gore. Now, Gore, of course, is an organization that you probably all have heard of. They are the 54-year-old maker of Gore-Tex and thousands of other products like Elixir guitar strings and Glide dental floss. They're an organization of 10,000 people across 50 locations around the world. This is somebody else's water. That wouldn't be too healthy to drink. and you know, they are an organization that's founded on a really different idea for being in business, and one that I think has been a management model that's sort of ahead of its time for more than half a century. So Bill Gore in 1958 set out to build an organization that had innovation at the core and was human to its core. Pretty healthy approach to an organization. And let me just unpack just a few pieces of their model, because there's so much to learn from when you look at Gore. You know, it's celebrated year in and year out as one of the most innovative organizations and best places to work. So the first thing to understand about Gore is there's no formal hierarchy. There are no job titles, no bosses, very few job descriptions of any kind, and everything is incredibly open. The focus is on, you know, direct personal relationships and conversation and communication. So ideas don't go up the chain of command and decisions don't go up the chain of command. They go directly out to the point of impact. And Bill Gore famously said, you know, when an organization gets over 200 people, we decided becomes they decided. So they famously cap the population of every one of their facilities at 200 people for that very reason, to keep it human scale and human size. Now, another thing they do is for associates. Now, everybody at Gore is an owner. They call them associates. They don't use the word employee. All commitments are voluntary. You decide what your job is. You negotiate it quite laboriously and time-intensively with your peers, but those negotiations are very productive of engagement and alignment down the road. And you know, amidst all this freedom, the way you find your bearings at Gore are, you know, myriad. So everybody at Gore gets a sponsor, this person who sort of guides you through the organization and becomes your buddy throughout the system, throughout your whole career at Gore. They also use peer regulation and peer review as kind of a regulating mechanism for all of this freedom. So it's a pretty brutal process of every year there's a forced ranking of a group of 20 to 30 close colleagues where the only question is, who is contributing the most to the enterprise? And you get listed 1 through 30, and the folks who are contributing the most get the most compensation, not the folks with the biggest job or the biggest job title. Terry Kelly, the CEO, tells me there's remarkable convergence around the top and the bottom of those forced rankings. So leadership at Gore is also not a product of the hierarchy. So Terry, the CEO, said to me, it's very simple. You're a leader at Gore if you have followers, not the other way around. And she said, we have this really simple test at Gore. Call a meeting. If no one shows up, you're not a leader. Pretty good. And I love this, and I always encourage people I talk to, why don't you try this at your organization? Make all meetings voluntary or optional. See who shows up. Nobody's done it so far, but if you do, please email me and tell me how it goes, because I think it's such a great, simple sort of test of the waters. Now, you know, the question that everybody asks about Gore is, you know, how, oh, I want to tell you one other thing that's so fantastic about Gore. So Terry Kelly, I've mentioned her a few times. She is the president and CEO. Yes, that is a job title. Now, at Gore, the boss is the B word. Literally, they call it the B word. At Gore, how did she become president and CEO? Well, by popular vote. She's an engineer who was a Gore lifer, and the question was put out to all the associates, who should lead Gore? Literally, that was the question. There was no short list of candidates, and to her surprise, she was named president and CEO. I mean, it's an incredible system the more you dig into it. And what really provides the fabric is this peer regulation, transparency. They provide tremendous order and alignment amidst all that freedom. But more important, Terry said, is this deep, deep sense of values. And at Gore, they come in terms of what they call beliefs and guiding principles, but they are their core values. And Terry says, look, the job of the leader is to be the person who articulates, advocates, and fiercely guards those values. She says to me, my job is to maintain the health of the organization. And by health, she means, how are the relationships inside teams? Is there the right distribution of voice and contribution throughout each team? And most importantly, she said, my job as a leader is to kind of step back, to not be the smartest person in the room, to not have all the great ideas, to not drive all the decisions. And while that might require some severe sort of leadership deprogramming for some people, I would suggest it's incredibly powerful when you remove that performance drag of top-down management systems. You open up so much room for engagement and alignment and ingenuity coming in and through your organization day in and day out. And I've seen it at Gore and other organizations like it. It's a pretty radical approach, though. Now, I want to move on to that third question, which is, you know, how do you create a genuine culture of innovation? Innovation is, of course, the word on everybody's tongues when it comes to organizations today. How do you switch on everybody in the organization to contribute at their fullest day in and day out? And you know, the one thing I know is sure is that in a world with so much change coming at us so quickly, challenges that are so immense, it is no longer possible for a couple geniuses at the top to have all the answers, to make all the decisions, to have the best ideas. It's just impossible, and anyone who thinks it's possible anymore is cuckoo, but that's your job. So if the old model was, you know, I have a great idea. What's my top-down mode of communication? The new model is, I need some great ideas, insights, new approaches. What's my bottom-up architecture of participation? And by that, I simply mean, what's the compelling invitation, the welcome mat I can roll out to the best ideas, insights from the best people out there, wherever they sit, inside the organization or beyond? How can I get them contributing their energy, their initiative, their passion to my cause. That requires a huge leadership mind flip. And it was kind of like the mind flip that Larry Houston had when he took over R&D for Procter & Gamble. You know, Procter & Gamble has the most storied research bench in the world. You know, 9,000 of the smartest, most highly paid researchers and scientists working on all kinds of different projects. And he looked at them and he said, there's no way these folks will ever be able to address all the areas that will be of interest and relevant to Procter & Gamble as we try to create our future. So what he did was, again, kind of unusual for leadership. Instead of sort of thinking about it internally, he went out into the world. He went to every scientific conference, university, research and development center. He just traveled the world. And what happened is he came back and said, you know what, there aren't 9,000 people who can work on Procter & Gamble's subjects. There are 1,809,000 people in the world who are working on and have talents that are relevant to the future in Procter & Gamble. The secret, the challenge is, how do I actually engage, connect, leverage, and reward those people's contributions in a way that will also help Procter & Gamble going forward? And he arguably actually kicked off this whole renaissance in third-party networks, platforms through which people, whether they're retired or whether they're scientists with, you know, some extra headroom that they wanted to play around with, where they could actually connect and contribute on projects that weren't their own, but that they would get rewarded for in some real way. Now, your number may be different than Larry Houston's, but I would suggest the question is the same. What untapped resources are lying in wait for you out there? How do you get leverage on what you're trying to do? How do you open up yourself to all kinds of new ideas, insights, and stay tuned into what's going on in the world? In other words, how do you move the conversation around where do we go next into the heads, hearts, and hands of the people who have their emotional equity invested in the future, not in the hands of the people who are rigidly, you know, defending the decisions of the past, which is where that conversation is mostly held. And, you know, I can't suggest that you can do exactly what Larry Houston did, but something that I think would be a little bit illustrative is to learn from my friend Jim LaVoy, who's one of my favorite leaders when it comes to being a leader of innovation. He asks this question a little bit differently. He says, how do I make every single person in the organization feel relevant to its future? That's sort of his bumper sticker as a leader. And Jim LaVoy is the co-founder and CEO of a 200-person software development organization based in Providence, Rhode Island. They do really complex software systems for the Department of Defense, mission-critical systems for emergency responders, and even systems for the back office of casinos and gaming operations. So really complex stuff. And it's really all the geniuses in the world that he got together to work on this. He came from the Department of Defense, and he wanted to create a company based around that question. And it's sort of founded on this refreshing humility for a couple of executives from a big organization, which is, you know, he said to me, I'm positive that the best and most important ideas do not come from the top. They come from somewhere else. And my job is to figure out how to unearth them and put them to work in a real way. And so Right Solutions is a company that, you know, exudes, I keep using this word health. I think it's so perfect because they exude that kind of health in terms of how do you organize so that everyone feels like they're making a vital contribution. Now, the first thing that they do is on your first day at Right Solutions, you show up to a full-blown party, balloons, decorations, wrap presents, birthday cake, and people celebrating your arrival. You even get a little birth certificate. Why? Jim said, why do people give you cake on your last day? Shouldn't they be giving it to you on your first day? And more importantly, they send, this is very sneaky, they send this gift basket to your family, to your spouse, and to your kids, because they know where the real loyalty is. So that's your first day. Your second day, you get an invitation that might even be more important, an invitation to play a real role in the future of the company. You get invited to play along with your colleagues in a stock market-based game called Mutual Fun. Not mutual fund, mutual fun. And basically imagine sort of a stock market portfolio meets social network. And instead of stocks, you're trading on ideas and projects that could be developed for Right Solutions Future. Everybody in the organization gets $10,000 in opinion money. Anyone can launch a new idea. You fill out your profile. You become an intellectual capitalist. You produce a new idea. It gets listed either on the Dow Jones or the SPAS deck, depending on how advanced it is. You create an expectus instead of a prospectus. You get how it's sort of sticky and fun to play this, and your idea immediately gets a ticker symbol. It gets listed at $10, and your peers can immediately start trading, making monetary investments in it, but also time, volunteering. If it's something they want to work on, they glom onto it, swarm it, and turn it into a project and see if they can take it further. And every day, an algorithm determines, the value of a particular stock, a particular portfolio, and players ranking on the leaderboard. So imagine sort of like Bloomberg meets Monopoly. It's sticky, it's immediately intuitive, it's fun, but it's also the beating heart of the organization now. And Jim said it's just so incredible. It's like a map, a dynamic map of where everybody thinks the future is. And I think some of his lessons are instructive for all of us. And the first is, he said, it is amazingly, he said it's criminally easy to tap in to this unused intellectual bandwidth, all the passions and interests that people who work for you never get to exercise, much less maximize at work. If you create any kind of a forum or mechanism to bring that forward, it's incredible what you'll get. One example, 2 young kids in the IT department said, hey, what if we brought this sort of Xbox environment to emergency decision making? It turned into a project that garnered a lot of interest. Their colleagues developed. It is now a product that accounts for 30% of Right Solutions revenues. Just incredible stuff. The second insight, Jim shared with me is that sometimes the most powerful ideas come from the most unlikely places. Innovation in companies is kind of like a contact sport. You go to the smart people go to the conferences, they get to hang out in the skunk works, the really vocal people raise their hand in meetings, but those quiet introverts, you guys know all about introverts and quiet people and the power of them, they have something to offer too. Again, if you create an architecture of participation where they might be able to share and speak up in their own way, you're going to get a wealth of contribution. Another example, Jim's administrative assistant, someone who knew nothing about the technology, was helping her daughter with a homework assignment and thought, hey, this bingo stuff that we do, this bingo technology that we do might be helpful in helping kids do pattern recognition. She ginned up a very general idea, put it up on Mutual Fund. Her colleagues and the technologists kind of took it to the next level. They sold this idea, licensed it to Hasbro for $1 million, and she shared in that profit. And you see this again and again. The third thing is, Jim said, it's really important for people to see that you're willing to take direction, not just sort of suggestion box, oh yeah, give me your ideas, I might get to them later, but real direction from the crowd. They will have more skin in the game. When you close the gap between the people who articulate the vision and the people who implement the vision, you close the gap between the thinkers and the doers, you create this virtuous cycle of engagement and alignment and productivity and creativity. And the other thing he said is, in so many companies, the conversation is focused on, the current as opposed to, what's possible. The conversation is, this is what we do, this is our product, this is what we're excellent at. When the conversation should really be, hey, this is what we could do based on what we know, what we've experienced, what we've done before. Such a vibrant way to go to work every day. And Jim LaVoie's particular genius as an innovation leader is that he thinks everybody in his organization has some kind of genius in them. And this is brilliant because we live in a world that increasingly recognizes that all of us have so much to give. It promotes the possibility that each one of us might be an inventor, a producer, even an artist. And more importantly, really begins to understand that the work of art, that brave and scary work of doing something original that has risk to it, that might change someone for the better, is the most important work of all. And as my friend Seth Godin says, that's where the value, all the value goes, even if you don't think of yourself as in an arty profession. So to me, the organizations that I just sort of glom onto, that I'm a fiend about discovering and investigating and learning more about, are those who recognize the value of unleashing that kind of potential, that have devised really clever approaches to helping all the people in their organization do that work of art. So no organization has done this more beautifully, in a more inspiring way, than Pixar Animation Studios. Now, any of you who have kids in this audience know Pixar. You probably know the dialogue of Finding Nemo by heart, and Toy Story and all that stuff. But Pixar really is a juggernaut of the first order, both in terms of its creativity. They reinvented the art of animation, and also in terms of its performance in the marketplace. $7 billion in global box office. They actually were sold to Disney for $7.4 billion about 6 years ago. And it's probably one of the big corporate acquisitions of a creative startup that is actually, working, that is actually still producing great results. But I would suggest that Pixar's success, its ability to churn out hit after hit, it is the hit factory, has to do with the fact that they somehow became the envy of Hollywood by never going Hollywood. So we all know the Hollywood model, right? Independent actors, technicians, directors, they work on projects on a contract basis, and it's all about how do I maximize, my star power, my earning power, and then I go on and I go work on something else. Well, Pixar said, no, that's not a great model. We want to figure out what a team of close-knit, long-term collaborators could do if they work together, not on contract, but on salary. Now, the salaries at Pixar are pretty darn good, but these big stars who could go off and work on contract, like Brad Bird, who directed The Incredibles, actually works on salary for Pixar and doesn't just work on his own projects, he works on everybody's project. And the conversation you hear inside Pixar is really a beautiful conversation, which is, how do you do art as a team sport? You hear that over and over again. How do you do art as a team sport? And I would submit that's a beautiful question, again, no matter what your work is. How do you do the state of the art and do it together? Pixar has some great answers to this question. Now, I said that Pixar did not go Hollywood. They're in the Bay Area, sort of gritty area called Emeryville. And you go to their headquarters, and you kind of go along this very imposing wrought iron and brick fence for what seems like a mile, and you arrive at the gatehouse. It's sort of like getting into the White House. There's a very stern security guard. He goes through all these, levels of clearance. Are you really allowed to go into Pixar? And then finally, you get your visitor's badge, and you look down at it, and it says, "A stranger from the outside." And all of a sudden, you are just bowled over. How great. I'm about to go into this magic factory, and these people get to go into this magic factory every day. How does that change how you feel about your work? You're going in to do the work of magic and the work of art. And so one of the answers to that question, how do you do art as a team sport, is make the workplace a canvas for that art, which in Pixar's case is storytelling. You walk in, the place is plastered in storytelling. What you do walk into, it's an old Dole factory that's been refurbished. It's a total palace to the people, beautiful rose gardens, swimming pools, and this huge atrium with a pizza oven and foosball and pool, all the stuff that you see in these Silicon Valley companies. But Steve Jobs, who was one of the co-founders of Pixar, had this notion that there should be only one restroom in the entire organization so that you would bump into all of your colleagues at some point every day. And everybody's like, I don't think so. So the facilities people said, that's not a great idea, but how about we put a mailbox in the central atrium? So it's kind of like college. You go get your mail and you bump into people, and in this atrium is sort of where all that great fusion of energy happens. But more importantly, you see immediately storyboards, color stories. You see art galleries of the art from the current film and individual art of people who work inside Pixar. Everybody's invited to look at the daily screenings, the rushes from the film that they're working on. Everywhere you go, you kind of bump into work in progress. The animators pit is just truly amazing. So the animators were given the outside sunny offices, and they said, no, we want to work together. So the facilities people said, fine, take the innards of the building. They did, and their sort of hack, their fix was to go to Home Depot, get a bunch of those garden sheds, and to pimp them out. So you go into the animators pit, and it is like, a medieval castle, a Wild West saloon, and, English library. There's one cubicle or Home Depot shed. You go into it, you touch a bust of Beethoven, a secret door opens, you put on a velvet smoking jacket, someone hands you a Pimm's cup, I'm not kidding, and you sit down and you hang out and you see that Eisner has been in there and all these famous animators have been in there. It's just part of this creativity pouring out of every surface of the place. And the point is, this notion that you can bump into work in progress, that it's open to everyone, that no matter who you are, you might have some new perspective, some fresh eyes on what they're working on, and your voice matters. They want you to comment on it. And it also maximizes fidelity, from an idea in the creator's head to the marketplace, if everybody's in on the conversation all the way through. So where most organizations, 2 minutes, where most organizations hide and hoard and control information to control people, Pixar uses it to align people. The second way that they sort of make art a team sport is they put everyone on the same team. Everyone inside Pixar is expected to spend 4 hours of their very busy week at Pixar University, which has a full filmmaking curriculum, and then fun courses like improv and belly dancing and meditation. And the idea is that you spend time with your colleagues, learning something new, flailing, messing up, kind of falling on your butt and picking yourself up and, moving on. And the point is, you're not just learning about lighting or film, you're learning to see work in a new light, to work like an artist, to become more observant, more curious, more courageous. And I would submit that no organization in the world, no leader is exempt from that we would all benefit from approaching our work more like artists, being more open, experimental, courageous in everything that we do. And to that end, I just want to leave you with a final piece of advice around what it means to sort of be a healthy leader that I got from Dan Wieden, who's the co-founder of Wieden and Kennedy. He's the guy who actually wrote the words, "Just do it" for Nike. True genius. And I was talking to him about what does it mean to be a leader? And he looked at me very thoughtfully. He was quiet for a moment. And he said, you know what? I think my job is to walk in stupid every day. Walk in stupid? Okay, what's that about? And he said, no, seriously, because no matter what organization you're in, what industry you work in, something has changed overnight. And it's on you to walk in fresh, to sort of forget all the assumptions that got you there. The business world, we value the experience curve, mastery, credentials. I'm at the top of my game. Well, I suggest that we value the inexperience curve just as much. The longer you've done something, the more you have to shake off all the assumptions and ideas and frameworks that got you where you are, and to approach the world with those fresh eyes, with a sense of real intellectual humility. And so I want to leave you, if you take anything away from my remarks tonight, it's sort of counterintuitive for a talk like this, but when you go back to your offices on Monday morning, try walking in just a little bit stupider. Thank you so much.